Okay. Hello, everybody in junior seminar. I wanted to spend about 10 minutes, 15 minutes talking about this chapter called Work. It's chapter 4 in a book by a guy named Sigismund Bauman. The book is called Liquid Modernity, and it's a difficult book. This chapter is erudite. It uses lots of big words and it deals with really big ideas. There are a lot of references to people you've never heard of, a lot of French philosophers and German philosophers and American philosophers. Bauman is himself a social scientist, and this book is best understood like Graeber's book, Bullshit Jobs. It's best understood as a work of social science and an attempt to create a model or a thick description of the experience of life in what Bauman calls liquid modernity. Now, he writes this book at the end of the 90s, probably 1999. 98, he's writing it. 99, he publishes it. And one of the first things that I'll note is that he wrote it like 10 years before Facebook, 15 years before Google. It's just astonishing how prescient this book is, especially about technology that hadn't even really been invented when Bauman was writing this. Bauman taught at Leeds. He was Polish, he was Jewish, fled Poland, fled probably the Russian Empire, and settled in England and taught sociology at Leeds at a university for a very long time. And after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the establishment of democracy, more or less, in Poland, he made he spent a lot of time in Warsaw, working at universities in Poland. So he spent maybe the last 10 years of his life as a dual citizen of Poland and the United States. He died a couple years ago, a very old man. Okay. So the first thing that you should understand is that Bauman is a Marxist. But he's not really a Marxist. And nor is he, a lot of people who are smart would say that he's part of the Frankfurt School. And I don't think that's right either. That Frankfurt School, it's a bunch of Marxists who, I'm really going to simplify things, who said Marx was right, but the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe is wrong. In other words, the interpretation in the USSR of Marxism was incorrect or incorrectly applied or not representative of what Marx had intended. So there was a group of philosophers and social scientists and writers who accept Marxism and Marx's writings, but reject communism and Marxism as it was practiced in the 20th century in the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, China. So I don't think that's right. Actually, I think that I think that it's more complicated than that, and that in many respects, Bauman admires capitalism. By the way, so did Marx. But also admires Marxism, but rejects them both, and that's an interesting position to be in. Basically, I would say that Bauman. So there's a school of thought that goes that music was ruined by Bach. I think Bauman might actually think that as well. I think that Bauman is almost paleological. I think that he basically rejects modernity as a whole, so rejects everything after, say, 1600. I think that comes through pretty clearly in this chapter, and I'll make a case for it at the end. I'm going to give you this idea map of this chapter. Gosh, it's a really tough chapter. So remember that, or I'll tell you that. So in Marxism, well, they say the superstructure reflects the substructure, and that's that's code, and it kind of means something like this: economic order is important beyond just economic order because it concatenates, it organizes, arranges everything else. And so, a Marxist would believe that one way to think about this is that the right economic system will produce the right social structure. Or another way to think about this is that it's not just our economy that is a market-based, capitalistic organization, but that our familial ties are capitalist, that our relationships with our friends are capitalist, that the way that we act in public is capitalist, that television is capitalist, so you get this idea that the economic order pervades all of reality. And so Bauman definitely accepts that, and it's crucially important that you understand that what he is interested in as a social scientist is examining the ways that economic structure, or more specifically changing economic structure, ramifies throughout all of the social interactions that people have. And so this chapter is about work, and it's about how work is inflected, shaped, articulated by this concept of what Bauman calls liquid modernity. And he says something like, there's this period when modernity was solid, and he means something like, let's say from the beginning of the 19th century to be near the end of the 20th century. So for a long time, historically for a very short amount of time, but for you and me and the way that we think about the world, a couple hundred years of what he calls solid modernity that kind of peaks around 1900, and then it collapses, and he's trying to chart the collapse of solid modernity into what he calls liquid modernity. And so he has these ideas about modernity, about this time period, and so again, like when he says liquid modernity and solid modernity, and he talks about modernity, what you really have to understand, I think, is our totality, our experience of the world. That's modernity. That's what he calls modernity. Our social relations, the music we listen to, the television that we watch, the way we get married. Again, so this is this idea of complete, this total, all social interactions, and that's what he calls modernity. It's a loaded word, and I probably wouldn't myself have chosen the word modernity. But okay, that's what he means. And he says that there was a period of solid modernity, and now we're entering this period of liquid modernity. And he was writing this 20 years ago, so we're now well in this era of liquid modernity. And he also says that this modernity, this experience, this totality of social relations is predicated on, shot through with, shaped by, and he has these terms, heavy capitalism and light capitalism. And so heavy capitalism corresponds to this period of solid modernity, and light capitalism corresponds to this era of light capitalism. So liquid modernity, light capitalism, heavy capitalism, solid modernity. And I'll point out importantly, that this era of what he calls solid capitalism is also the era of Marxism in the Soviet Union. And in fact, he, not in this chapter, you see a bit of it in this chapter, his contention goes something like, the experience of the Soviet Union and the communist world was really not substantially different from the experience of capitalism in the 19th and 20th century, really just the 20th century. So he's making these total claims about the world, about not just the capitalist world, not just the communist world, but generally the experience, and I guess we could say first and second world of the West. These are all really complicated and troubling terms, but they're good to gesture with. So that's so remember, his contention is going to be that our experience of the world modernity is heavily inflected by the kind of capitalism, the kind of economic order that pervades the world. Okay? So, and he starts the chapter with Ford, Henry Ford, because for him, Ford is emblematic of this idea of the era of heavy capitalism. So it's at the very beginning of the 20th century, and Ford, the guy who in Detroit built cars, in many respects, is responsible. How to say this? The fate of America and Ford are deeply intertwined. So he starts with these quotes from Ford. History is bunk. We control the present, and therefore we control the present. And so Bauman remarks on this attitude, which he insists is pervasive, and he points at the city buildings in Leeds where he's writing this book, and says, you see the exact same attitude towards time everywhere you look at this period, and this period of heavy capitalism, of solid modernity. And this is the era where there is a pervasive belief in progress. It's a big topic in the first quarter of this chapter. And Bauman makes an argument, I think a pretty solid and self-evident one, that progress is a concept constructed by people who feel that they have control over the present, and that therefore they can shape the future. And Bauman says that we express this agency, this utility, through work. And so Ford, who owns these factories and is the boss of all of these workers and produces this great consumer good called the automobile, is emblematic of this concept that we control production, and that therefore we can shape the future, and that we're all working collaboratively and socially, this is so important, towards this future. And so there's this idea of all of us being very limited, I know, but okay, all of us in 1900 with Ford, all of the Western world working together on a single project that is a utopia project that will bring the world into alignment with reason, these are all quotes from Bauman. These are all things that Bauman says. And he calls this. He points out that this partakes in what he calls, or what is called, the Joshua discourse. And just as an aside, Joshua is a chapter in the Bible that is largely about how God keeps his promises. And he says, if the Israelites do this in this particular way, I promise that I'll be a good God. That's what Joshua is about, and that's what the Joshua discourse is about. This idea of providence that we've talked about before. The idea that if there's a God, that God has promised us utopia, has promised us paradise on earth, one that will reflect the order and harmony of heaven. That will be our reward. If we all work together on this common project of welfare, we will eventually create a world that's perfect. And time will stop. Because that's what perfect means. It means finished. And so there's this implicit ideology of expressed in these statements by Ford, like, history is bunk. We don't care about history. We care about the present, because we're all working together to create our harmonious paradise that's in the future. Now, I'm going to read sometimes a little bit, not much, from this book, and we all have the same copy. And you'll see that I've spent a lot of time reading this book and thinking about this book. I think it's a lot. I think a lot of it. So on page 133, we're introduced into this theme of the book. Essentially, this old order, let's call it the Joshua world, is cracking. It's falling apart. Power is no longer centralized around work. Politicians have lost control, because things have become liquid and light. And so that's the whole theme of the book, but it's the theme of this chapter as well. Ways in which work, the concept of work, our relationship with work, how we work, our ideas of work, our social totality of work is changing. So things have become liquid and light versus the solidity and heaviness of the old world, of the Joshua world. Bauman says that essentially capital and leaders and power and authority have left the building. And he likens the experience that we are having to the realization that you have you're in a jet up 30,000 feet, and somebody opens the cockpit and you realize that there's no pilot. And he says that's the sense that we have of the world. That's liquid modernity. He writes, and some of these things are just brilliant. Like he says, there was a time when people believed in revolution, and what revolution meant, and what happened in the Russian Revolution and the 1812 Revolution, 1870, 1970 revolutions, the student uprisings, over and over again. The idea of a revolution is that you find out where the power is, and then you attack the building, and you capture the people who are in power, and you assume power, or you change those people, you convince those people they're wrong, or something like that. So there's this idea of power being instantiated and localized, and being held and exercised by people, and that's revolution is predicated on that. Like, we're going to take over this building, we're going to throw out the politicians, and we're going to take charge. But Bauman says, how can we have a revolution if no one's in charge? How can we have a revolution if you can't identify who the leaders are. And even if you did and you changed them, not only would you discover that there is no power in those chairs, but moreover, you don't know what to do. You don't know how to improve things. And I think of the Democratic Party a lot when I read Bauman. That calls into question the very concept of progress, of change. How can you have progress? How can you have change if there's no rudder, if there's no steering wheel, if nobody's in charge? He says, what you discover is that power has fled in its Cessna. He has a lot of these lapidary phrases, these quotable things. I like this about him. Capital, what you discover is power has fled in its Cessna. In other words, rich people who own all the means of production, now that production is detached, and he's going to make this argument in a second, but like, so he makes these statements first, and then he makes the argument. It's backwards maybe. But Bauman says power has fled in its Cessna, and the reason it can flee is that power is no longer heavy. And so there's this concept, heavy capitalism again. It's no longer Ford's world. It's no longer the world of factories and machines that are in a place and that are immovable, and that form a link between capital, bosses, and labor, employees. That's true, right? Like if you think about the way that Ford's factories worked, there were lots of really heavy, big things in a certain place in Detroit, and Ford depended on knowledgeable workers using those machines to produce cars. And so one of Bauman's contentions about heavy capitalism is that it bound capital and labor, it bound bosses and employees to a common cause, and it gave them all a sense of community and social cohesion, and also the idea that they were working towards a more perfect union, towards a future, a paradise. And here's where I'm thinking that like Bauman isn't showing all of his cards here. He never really does, and like Bauman is making an argument about loneliness. One like if you ask me to title this chapter something other than work, I would call it loneliness, and it's the loneliness of work now, in this world of liquid modernity and light capitalism. No longer is work something that we do socially and we come together in a place to do it and we see and feel and touch one another, but now work has become something you do remotely. I'm aware of all of these ironies that are going on right now in the pandemic, and how poignant this experience of remoteness and social distancing is. But this is what Bauman is writing about 20 years ago, with no knowledge of coronavirus, no knowledge of Google and Facebook and Zoom, and YouTube and all this stuff, which, right. This sense of cooperation and belonging was made possible by heavy capitalism. And he has this great example. He says that just think about this. Think about like a heavy log, and you need 8 guys to pick up this log, and it takes them an hour to move it. But then he says something that's great, and he says, that log, it needs 8 people to move it in an hour, and one man can't do it in 8 hours, right? And that's what, and he's trying to get at the essence of what heavy capitalism means. It's like something that requires social interaction and requires the presence and requires the bodies of people, and it can't be done remotely, and it can't be done by one person. And so there's an essential difference in the kind of work and production and consumption eventually that goes on in heavy capitalism and light capitalism, in solid modernity and liquid modernity, and the kind of work that goes on in liquid modernity is really lonely, and it's lonely in part because the bosses have all fled in their Cessnas, leaving us workers behind. But it's also that there aren't, so to speak, logs for us to move any longer. So he's looking at the situation, and we're all now alone together. We no longer work with one another. We work parallel, sometimes against one another. The Joshua world has ended, but we still have to do something. We have to and so now he makes this next move, and I'll read you in just a second, directly from the text. And his second move is, like, work is no longer what it used to be, but we still have to do something with our time, and we still work, and we still lend work a lot of significance. We spent the whole semester talking about the concept of work. And so I'm going to read you this, and it's from page 137. It's the last paragraph on page 137. Oh, and he uses this word, Unsicherheit, unsureness, it's uncertainty, but it's also, it's great because it has this word sich in the middle of it. It's a German word, and it has this word self in the middle of it, and so it's like, I have a feeling when I see that word of not only being uncertain and unclear, but also not being myself and not feeling like I'm manifesting myself. All right, ready? I'm gonna read this. When Unsicherheit becomes permanent and is seen as such, being in the world, that's a Heideggerian term, feels less like a law-bound and law-abiding, logical, consistent, and cumulative chain of actions, and more like a game in which the world out there is one of the players and behaves as all players do, keeps its cards close to its chest. As in any other game, plans for the future tend to become transient, protean, and fickle, reaching no further than the next few moves. With no state of ultimate perfection looming on the horizon of human efforts, with no trust in the foolproof effectiveness of any effort, the idea of total order to be erected floor by floor in a protracted, consistent, purpose-guided effort of labor makes little sense. That's his description, one of his many descriptions of heavy capitalism, this idea of building stuff floor by floor and carefully according to a plan that eventuates in paradise. I'm going to read on. The less hold one has on the present, the less of the future can be embraced in the design. Stretches of time labeled future get shorter and shorter, and the time span of life as a whole is sliced into episodes dealt with one at a time. Continuity is no longer the mark of improvement. The once cumulative and long-term nature of progress is giving way to demands addressed to every successive episode separately. The merit of each episode must be revealed and consumed in full before it is finished and the next episode starts. So I'm going to stop there. That's brilliant, by the way, and I could say this some other way, and I'll put it in a way that maybe you'll understand better. Maybe like think about like the corporate world and the stock market, and we went from a time when you built a market and you built consumers and you built very slowly and laboriously a product. So let's say like Sears. And you have this long-term relationship with your customers that is a product of having worked very closely with them and slowly and built up these stores that serve needs. And then we have in this corporate world this perception, and I think it's actually true, that now stocks, corporations are judged every year, and you're expected to improve the stock price and release a dividend and show profit immediately, and if it's not, you're doing something wrong. And so there's this difference, right? You get this like, on the one hand we have heavy capitalism and solid modernity, and the idea of slowness, progressiveness, the collaboration, working towards a goal, which has been replaced, and this is Bauman again, which has been replaced the once cumulative and long-term nature of progress is giving way to demands addressed to every successive episode separately. So I'm just trying to draw a parallel, right? Okay. All right, I'm going to talk really, really briefly about this idea of a labyrinth that he goes into, and that he develops this idea earlier and at length in the introduction. And so you come across it and you aren't quite ready for it. But here's the deal. He uses this idea of a labyrinth, which he sees as the meeting place between nomads and settled people. And he says that the labyrinth is a metaphor. And it's a metaphor for time and progress and human agency. And so he says, essentially, that the project of modernity, really the project of civilization in the sense of settled people, and so this, I guess, stretches back to 10,000 BC, when the first medium-sized cities like Ur are being built, and this idea is that our project as settlers has always been to overcome the labyrinth. And the premise here is that if we work long and hard enough at it, the labyrinth can be made transparent, and we'll discover how to get through the labyrinth. And we'll do that by lots of descriptions and maps and windows. And Bauman writes, that's the project of the Enlightenment, this idea of clarity and reason. And he points out, or he makes this claim, that what we've discovered is that the more information that we try to apply to the labyrinth, the more confusing and darker and dangerous the labyrinth becomes. And the more that chance and surprise are the rule in the labyrinth, which is just the opposite of the clarity and predictable nature that we seek to establish in the labyrinth. This is really brilliant, what he says. Now I'll rephrase it in this way. The Enlightenment project has always been that we'll just thickly detail our experience of the world. This is Kant and all of our experience in the world. We'll write the perfect histories. We'll make these scientific discoveries, and we'll align ourselves with reason. But the discovery that you have in liquid modernity, and this is a very postmodern predicament, is that the more you try to explain it, the less clear something gets. I'll give you a great example of this really briefly. I'm sure you hate my syllabus. It's hilarious. Every year somebody says, I'm so confused by all of these deadlines and all of this detail in the syllabus. Could you just give us a list of the assignments and when they're due? And I always laugh at that, because it's like, there's so much information in this. Can you give us more information? So, right, this very Enlightenment sort of reaction is that the idea that you can just give a little bit more information and everything will suddenly crystallize and concatenate itself into a perfect system. But that's funny. Can you give us more information? All this information is confusing us. And this is the cyber mole problem that Bauman talks about this this theoretical robot that can find the nearest electrical outlet and plug itself in, and it plugs itself in so that it can detach from that outlet and find the next electrical outlet. In other words, its activity and the source of its activity are the same. I don't know where I was going with that. The settlers become involuntary nomads. And so that's what he says. He says, like, what's happened is that we thought we were building this perfect union and this paradise and this utopia, that we were going to make everything clear, that we were going to align ourselves with reason. This is the Joshua doctrine. This is the Joshua world. And now that's not happening. And the more that we try to rectify that, the more that we try to reestablish the Joshua world, the more we discover that we can't, and the more precarious our situation becomes. It's just like, can you add more information? All this information is confusing me. So the connection to work here goes from this universe of order building, this Joshua universe, this Joshua world, and future control. In liquid modernity, we suddenly find ourselves just playing games in the realm of games. Solid has become liquid and heavy has become light. And here's this sense of nostalgia. Here's a little quote, a simplified quote. Stripped of its eschatological trappings and cut off from its metaphysical roots, that is to say, work used to be something that made us holy. This idea of the Protestant work ethic, for instance. Graeber talks a lot about this. Now work has lost that sense of the holiness and the connection, because it has shifted from the Ford factory to the nomad. We're just playing games. We're just, now we all just make cat memes, as Graeber says. I'm going to read you a little quote. I'm coming almost to the end here. I'm sorry this is going on. This is the last bit on page 139. Instead, work has acquired, alongside other work-life activities, a mainly aesthetic significance. It's no longer serious. It's no longer something practical and pragmatic. It's become something to appreciate, something to admire. It's aesthetic. It is expected to be gratifying by and of itself, rather than being measured by the genuine and putative effects it brings to one's brothers and sisters in humanity, or in the might of the nation and the country, let alone the bliss of future generations. This is again, Joshua. This is this social work has become isolated and fragmented. Only a few people, and then only seldom, can claim privilege, prestige, or honor, pointing to the significance and common benefit of the work they perform. Graeber, Ehrenreich, hardly ever is work expected to ennoble its performers, to make them better human beings, and rarely is it admired and praised for that reason. It is instead measured and evaluated by its capacity to be entertaining and amusing, satisfying not so much the ethical Promethean vocation of the producer and creator as the aesthetic needs and desires of the consumer, the seeker of sensations and the collector of experiences. Again, this should ring bells with Ehrenreich and Graeber. All right, I really need to end this. These are such great quotes. Ready? I'm just going to skip to the end and read you this quote. And I think this is really, for me, it's so full of nostalgia. It's melancholy, and it's what makes me think that Bauman most wants to go back to a pre-industrial world of authenticity and immediacy, of social connection, of real decisions, when things meant something and they weren't just games and aesthetics. So remember I said earlier that as a Marxist he thinks that the economic system pervades everything. This chapter, like I said, is about loneliness and about sex, and about relationships and about the precariousness, the Unsicherheit of love. And so it's weird, but maybe it's not too surprising that in many respects this chapter purports to be about work, but it's also about the work that's involved in building relationships. You remember the article we read by Hochschild about the changing workplace. I'm going to read you this paragraph and then we're going to stop. There is, though, one more link between the consumerization of a precarious world and the disintegration of human bonds. This theme, right? This idea that the economic system, liquid modernity, light capitalism, it pervades everything, even our love, human bonds. Unlike production, consumption is a lonely activity, endemically and irredeemably lonely, even at such moments as it is conducted in the company of others. Tinder. Productive, as a rule, long-term efforts require cooperation, even if what they call for is just adding up raw muscular forces. If carrying a heavy log from one site to another takes 8 men 1 hour, it does not follow that one man can do the same task. Can do the same given 8 or any number of hours. In the case of more complex social tasks, which involve the division of labor and call for diverse specialist skills, which cannot meet and blend in one person's know-how, the need for cooperation is even more obvious. Again, this is the idea of the Ford factory. Without it, there would be no chance for any product to emerge. It is the cooperation which makes the scattered and disparate efforts into productive ones. In the case of consumption, though, cooperation is not only unnecessary but downright superfluous. Whatever is consumed individually, even in a crowded hall. Nostalgia for the sense of belonging that is inherent in the production of heavy capitalism. A fondness for real human bonds that have been rendered impossible in this age of liquid modernity. I'll end it there. This is just this is so smart. I could talk about this forever.